My name is Joe Barr. I'm the director of the Traffic, Parking, and Transportation Department. And we'll be going through a presentation for you this evening on the current status of the design for the project. But a couple of announcements before we get started. One is there will be an opportunity for questions and answers at the end of the presentation, which hopefully will take about 45 minutes to get through. There's a lot of information in the presentation, and so we'd ask that folks hold questions until we're done, because it's very likely that questions you may have or things you may get tripped up by may get explained later in the presentation. Like I said, we're more than happy to answer questions towards the end, but we do want to try to get through the presentation before we get into the questions. There will also be an opportunity for some smaller groups, breakout groups, after the Q&A, hopefully by 7:15 or so. Just if folks want to talk with staff or our consultants in more detail about specific issues or specific questions. But we did also want to give folks an opportunity to sort of ask us questions in a larger forum so that everyone can hear the answer to those more general questions. But again, if you have a very specific question, it may make sense to hold that until those discussion groups. But obviously, you know, we'll take whatever questions we get from all of you. I will mention a couple things about, we are being videotaped this evening by 22 City View. So just an FYI on that. We are going to ask folks to use the microphones when they're asking questions so that they can get picked up for the taping, and people can watch that later at home if they're having problems with insomnia, perhaps. I'll also mention we are joined by several of our elected officials this evening. Vice Mayor Devereaux is here, along with councilors Zondervan, Mallon, and Siddiqui, and I don't think I've missed anybody else. We expect to be joined later by the city manager, who plans to be here and is on his way, but he's not here quite yet. I also just remind folks, if you can make sure you please sign in if you want to get continuing updates, if you're not already on our mailing list about the project, future meetings, updates on where the project's going, and particularly as we move into construction at a later point, want to make sure folks can be updated about the construction process as that moves forward. So with those brief introductory remarks, I'll jump right into some background on the project, and then Patrick Baxter and Kathy Watkins are going to do most of the presentation this evening to update you on where we're at. So we're going to talk about this background. We're going to describe some work we've been doing over the last couple of months to evaluate concepts for Inman Square. As some of you may know, we had a meeting scheduled for early December, which we delayed until tonight because we were looking back at some possible changes to the design, and so we want to share with you where we're at with that analysis and kind of where we're heading in the future, and then we'll talk about next steps going forward. Just as a reminder about the timeline, we have been talking about improvements to Inman Square, well, in some form for many, many years, but in this current analysis, really since late 2014, early 2015, we started a more detailed study looking at traffic signal operations and safety issues in 2015, and then had a meeting about that in June of 2016. And then, unfortunately, right around that same time, we had a cyclist fatality in Inman Square. And that kind of reemphasized the need not to just study things, but actually to really try to get something done as quickly as we could to improve the square. And so that led to really two different pieces. One is what we're in the midst of tonight, which is this kind of more significant redesign of Inman Square. But the other is we did make some changes to Inman Square, banning some left turns, better marking some of the bike lanes, and trying to do what we could in the immediate short term to improve safety. But I think it's really important really to say two things. One is those safety improvements we have never felt were the full solution to what needs to change about Inman Square to make it as safe as possible. And also that we feel really every day that there are ongoing safety issues in Inman Square, and it's really critical that we move a project forward, make changes to the square. It's not a good situation as it stands right now, and we do want to make sure that we continue to move forward with changes that will resolve those safety issues. So since then, we've been working on this more significant capital project and been having a series of public meetings on that since really early last year. So like I said, we're up to our fourth public meeting this evening and wanted to kind of share where we're at. Just to remind folks that that initial transportation study identified a number of issues that we're trying to address. The most important, as I said, is really the one at the bottom about the rate of crashes and the safety concerns occurring.
Change the lights?
Yeah, there's not a way to do that interactively. So we will make this presentation available online tomorrow morning. But there were also complaints about delay for really all modes, both drivers, but also, I think very importantly, pedestrians and cyclists moving through the square. And we just know that the way the intersection is today, it's a very large intersection with almost a football field's length between the stop bars in either direction on the main streets. And any intersection that is that large is inherently going to operate inefficiently. And so the solution very quickly in that initial transportation study became clear that we could not solve this just with retiming the traffic lights or making other tweaks to the intersection. We really needed to look more fundamentally at the design, and that's, like I said, kind of what led us to this, the situation we're in today of trying to do a more significant project. There's clearly issues with the locations of crosswalks. As I said, the size of the intersection is very large. We have this very strange situation, I would say, on Antrim Street or on Hampshire Street coming to Antrim, where you're traveling sort of through a signalized intersection, but there's not actually a signal controlling that movement, and that's something we really want to resolve. And just in general, the intersection operates in, frankly, what I would say is almost is a fairly chaotic way, and that's just not a recipe for safety and clear operations. So that leads us really to this, which is the primary goal of this project is to improve safety in the intersection. And about a year and a half ago, the city adopted a commitment to Vision Zero, which is saying that we are working to eliminate fatalities and serious injuries in our transportation system. And that's a goal that we take very, very seriously. And so it really is important to say that that goal does rise above other goals in what we're trying to accomplish with this project. All that said, there's a lot of other things we are trying to get done. In addition to making it safer for all of these users, we're trying to make it more convenient and easier to use, reduce some of those large crosswalks, better accommodate folks' desires to travel in more direct paths, and have crosswalks that really connect the key destinations within the square. And we want to try to avoid, to the extent we can, conflicts between different types of users. So if we can give pedestrians or give cyclists a more protected way to move through the intersection, that's really a benefit to their safety, which will further encourage those users to travel by those sustainable modes. We are trying to make it work a little bit better for cars. That's not a primary goal, but we do want to make sure that we've reduced delay for motor vehicles to the extent we can, and importantly make it very clear how to move through the intersection. And also we want to make sure that we limit the impact on parking. We understand that the parking in the square is a very important element of what makes it successful as a business location, and we want to continue to encourage that. So the parking impacts are very critical to us. At the same time, we are looking at transit. There are a number of bus routes that travel through the square. Particularly the 69 bus on Cambridge Street is a relatively busy route that we think could be busier if it ran a little bit more reliably and perhaps a little bit more frequently. So we are trying to create better create priority for buses and better facilities for buses moving through the square. We've also heard a lot as we've gone through this project about people's experience of using the open space or the plaza space, particularly Vellucci Plaza, and looking for improvements in that experience and the quality of the plaza space. And even though we would probably love to see fewer trucks, at least moving through Inman Square, we know that those trucks are going to continue to be there. There's a lot of deliveries happening to Inman Square. There's businesses in Inman Square that make deliveries from that location, and so truck access is something we need to definitely preserve and if anything, try to enhance, at least for the local access. And then again, probably something that everyone, including the fire department, would like to change, but not something that we're see any opportunity to change. We do have a fire station located right in the heart of the square, which is operationally very challenging for everybody, but it's there. We need to accommodate that use, and obviously it's a significant public safety issue to make sure that that fire station can continue to operate effectively going forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Patrick Baxter, who's the engineering manager in my department, to talk more about the concepts that we've been working on.
So I'm just going to go through a couple different things that we've been looking at. So first, you're going to see up here on the screen, we have the current concept. If you've been to our previous meetings, you've likely seen this concept as it's gone through several layers of revision. It was one of the initial concepts that we saw back in January when we were looking at 4 different alternatives, and then we were moving through the design process. This was finalized as the preferred concept back in the spring of 2017. So that said, over the last few months, we had heard from several groups of business owners and residents that they had significant concerns about some of the issues with this concept, and they asked us to kind of go back to the drawing board, take a look and see, is there a way that we can accomplish all of the goals of this project, or the majority of the goals, especially those related to safety, while reducing the impacts on Vellucci Plaza and possibly providing some improved truck loading opportunities. So we did go back to the drawing board, and we were able to pull together this alternative concept, which is a variation on one of the concepts that was originally shown back in January of 2017. What we did was we worked with the consultants to identify several of the changes that were made through that process, through the public process, what we heard from residents and business owners to improve those concepts. You'll see here some of the changes we brought into the plan include the two-way Springfield Street. We heard very strongly from residents of Somerville that they did not like the idea of a one-way Springfield Street, which was originally shown in most of the other concepts back in January. We did look at the opportunities for a transit priority lane on Cambridge Street, similar to what is shown in the preferred concept. And again, this maintains the alignment of Hampshire Street and kind of bends Cambridge Street around to meet it, as opposed to the preferred concept from the previous meetings, which kind of did the reverse of bending Hampshire Street around to meet Cambridge Street, carrying Cambridge Street through on a straight alignment. This allows Vellucci Plaza to remain in the existing location. However, it does have several significant concerns, which I'm going to go through as we move through this presentation. So going back to the current concept, one key feature of the signal phasing for the current concept is it restores the left turns that were banned in November of 2016 as a response to some of the safety concerns in the intersection. It does so, it keeps those turns as a protected movement, so there's a separate lane for vehicles waiting to make a turn if they're going from Hampshire Street to Cambridge Street in either direction. They're able to enter the intersection and then make that turn through the intersection. So you start off with a phase for Cambridge Street, for Hampshire Street. They go through the intersection. You get a through phase where the turns are protected from Cambridge Street. That means the right turns receive a red signal indication that allows pedestrians and bicycles to move on concurrent movements without having to worry about conflicting turns. We've got a phase to allow vehicles to exit from Springfield Street, and then we've got the through vehicles for Hampshire Street. And again, those vehicles are able to stop within the intersection in those center lanes and wait for the phase where they're able to continue and complete that left turn. While looking at the alternative concept, it became apparent that it is necessary to maintain the left turn restrictions in order to allow this intersection to operate safely and efficiently for all users of the intersection. So it would start off with a phase for through vehicles on Hampshire Street. You've got in each phase a brief clearance phase, which allows vehicles to exit the intersection, and then it moves on to Cambridge Street. This kind of brings up one, as we've been thinking about it, a really fatal flaw with this intersection, in that it requires drivers within the intersection, depending on which street they arrive from, to see a very different condition and operation of the intersection. So what I'm going to show you here is what you're seeing as your vehicle. You've come down from Somerville, you've entered on the Hampshire Street approach, you go through the first signal, you get a green signal indication. You come to the second intersection. As we have indicated, the left turns are prohibited. So you'll see an electronic sign that says no left turn, and you'll see a straight arrow. Your only option at that location is to continue moving straight. Similar to what you see today, you're not allowed to stop and turn left. If you do so, you're blocking up the intersection. You're stopping, you're waiting, and then the vehicles behind you aren't able to pass. You're causing safety issues behind you as vehicles might stop and queue up through the intersection. And if you do choose to disregard that signal indication, you're then crossing through an oncoming stream of vehicles, a stream of bicycles, a stream of pedestrians, another stream of bicycles, and another stream of pedestrians. So, making that left turn at that time is certainly not a safe maneuver. Following up on that phase, Cambridge Street receives the green signal indication. So a Cambridge Street vehicle moving eastbound headed towards Leechmere comes into the intersection, makes a right turn into the internal intersection, and then makes a left turn out. So if you remember previously, a car on Hampshire Street saw a no left turn sign. The Cambridge Street vehicle sees a green left turn arrow. That sets up kind of a confusing issue with the intersection in that the Cambridge Street driver is being told they're allowed to turn left and they have a protected phase, they get a green arrow, while the Hampshire Street driver is being told you're not allowed to turn left, you must proceed straight. This is a little bit different from what we typically see in other intersections across the city, where we either have a full-time left turn restriction like you see in Central Square from Mass Ave at Prospect Street, you're never allowed to turn left, or other locations where you might have a protected left turn, you see a red left arrow, that means you stop, you wait, you'll get your indication, and you're able to proceed. In this location, the Hampshire Street driver is seeing a very different indication, and if they disregard that, they're causing safety issues, and they're log jamming the intersection so people aren't able to get through. Looking at the traffic signal cycle, they're overall fairly similar. Today, one of the issues we've heard from a lot of people, you've got the very long cycle, which is a function of the very large 7-leg intersection. As Joe mentioned, it's almost a football field between the stop bars on the Cambridge Street approaches and the Hampshire Street approach. So we have an existing 160-second cycle. For purpose of comparison, typically we target a maximum of 90 seconds for a signal cycle in Cambridge. Under the current concept, we have that down to 90 seconds during both the morning and the afternoon peak hours. For the alternative concept, we are slightly longer at about 120 seconds in the morning and 100 seconds in the afternoon. However, in both cases, you are below the 160 seconds for the existing condition. So thinking about our evaluation criteria in comparing these concepts both now and earlier on in this process, we were looking at items like plaza space within the intersection, the tree canopy, maintaining environmental goals in terms of urban heat island, alignment with Vision Zero, where as our primary goal here is really to make a safe intersection that everybody is clearly able to understand. That really mandates that the intersection be clear and intuitive for all users. We're looking to reduce travel delay for all modes. We especially find with pedestrians, the longer you have to wait, the more likely you are to get frustrated and perhaps walk against the don't walk signal and then cause a potential safety issue in those crosswalks. We are also looking at transit improvement opportunities. And then, of course, the curb use, looking to maintain as many of the existing parking spaces as possible and ensure that we have loading zones for all the vehicles delivering to all the businesses in the square. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kathy Watkins to talk a little bit about the plaza.
Hi, so I'm Kathy Watkins from Public Works. I just want to go through the evaluation criteria, particularly looking at the plaza space and the tree canopy, because that's really where a lot of the differences are between these two options, and particularly why people had asked us to sort of go back and relook at what are options that have different plaza impacts and different options for the plaza. And which is the red button? This one? The top one. The top one, okay. So when we initially started this project, we asked people, there was a survey and it was very general, and it asked people about sort of, do you think Vellucci Plaza should stay the way it is today? And we heard pretty strongly from people that there are a number of things that don't work in the plaza. And so we could talk about different ways of addressing those concerns, but overall there's a lot of concerns with how the plaza operates today.
Kathy, was that an online survey?
It was online as well as at meetings and other places. So again, it's not a scientific survey, it's one we've heard from the Neighborhood Association, we've heard from individual surveys. So it's not in any way a scientific response, but there was about 450 responses. And so just thinking about how the plaza operates today, oops, does that not work? So this is an image of the plaza today, and it was renovated a little over 10 years ago, and the intent at that time had really been to open it up, make it more inviting, have people really use the space, and I think it certainly operates better than it did before, but it still is not a particularly heavily used space. It is very disconnected from the businesses and the rest of the square, so it's certainly one of the things we've heard about why this plaza isn't more animated and more utilized, is sort of the disconnection from the rest of the square. And so we think about, what makes successful plazas and what makes people have them activated and want to use them. And, this was a conversation we started at the last meeting to talk about plazas. And, we want spaces that are flexible, functional, memorable, that are really interesting and sort of draw people into the space, have active users. And I think, one of the things we've heard about Vellucci Plaza is really concern about connections to the adjacent businesses and wanting to be able to support those local businesses. So these are some images that we've looked at when we think about, what could plazas be, and some of these are in Cambridge, and really just thinking about what draws people to spaces and makes it that memorable open space and wants to be something that people want to come back to with their kids and hang out. So again, if we think about the existing Vellucci Plaza, it's about 6,500 square feet in a contiguous space here. And again, part of it is it's very disconnected from the streets, from the other businesses, and difficult to get to. So the current concept, going back to sort of the discussion Patrick was having, the current concept maintains a smaller Vellucci Plaza on the existing side and then shifts sort of an additional Vellucci Plaza to the other side that's more adjacent to the businesses. And, there's some pros and cons here, and I just want to talk through those a little bit. One of the pros we've heard from people is that, this puts the open space adjacent to more active commercial businesses, has a better chance of being activated and heavily utilized, an opportunity to support the local businesses. One of the big concerns is that it impacts the street trees and then splits up the open space into two different parcels instead of one larger parcel. So then we look at the alternative concept. And with the alternative concept, it maintains Vellucci Plaza in its current location, and then it also adds a little bit of an additional open space down here, plaza space, so we have a total of about 7,300 square footage. This space, it's next to what's not a very active use, and so, there's some discussion about how active that space would be, but the overall amount of open space would be higher. And then we think about tree canopy, which is the other, the thing that's impacted by the current proposal. And so the current proposal impacts these first 4 larger trees in Vellucci Plaza. So there's 6 trees along the outside of Vellucci Plaza, the 2 in the back remain, and the 4 in the front would need to be removed for that realignment. So this is an image that just shows, again, an outline of the existing street trees in the area to give people an overall image of what the tree canopy is in Inman Square. So again, the alternative concept would maintain those existing trees in Vellucci Plaza, as well as maybe an opportunity for some additional, plantings in this space as well. So there is an opportunity to maintain those existing street trees. The current concept, and again, removes these 4. It's an opportunity to do additional plantings here in the newer Vellucci Plaza. And so we have some images showing, we haven't done the detailed design, and that's a conversation we want to have with people, but this gives sort of an imagery of what the plantings could be. And so if you're sort of looking into the future, what do those trees look like? And then I'll also come back and talk a little bit about the Springfield City parking lot and some changes we've been looking at with that in terms of overall tree canopy. And the one thing I just really want to highlight is that as we look at doing new tree plantings in a new plaza, we really look at what are the details that we're doing those plantings in. So these are some images showing some recent construction. This one's on Main Street in Kendall Square, where we did extensive excavation, and that's all for the support of the street trees that went in. So we removed all that soil, brought in sand-based structural soil to support the new street trees, and to really provide as high a quality planting area as we can for these trees, particularly in these dense urban areas that do have a harder time. And so as we look at the project, we would look at protecting the existing street trees with protection of the tree during construction, air spading of roots, and then as we look at the new trees, we would look at, extensive sand-based structural soil, make sure we have a system for watering, and make sure they can really thrive over time. So these are some images on Western Avenue, which had a pretty extensive sand-based structural soil and has been in place for about 2 to 3 years. And what you see is that these trees here, there's some existing trees, the larger trees. These trees here, which have the gator bags on the bottom, are actually new street trees, and those have done really well. So if you go up and down Western Avenue, particularly in May or June, once the trees come back out, you'll see that these tree plantings have done really well in that environment. As we looked at, okay, so we have this current proposal, and it does impact tree canopy, and what are the ways that we can address that looking broadly at Inman Square? So we've looked at what are the tree details of what we're planting in the plazas, but also in the overall Inman Square, what can we do to increase tree canopy and reduce urban heat island? And so we expanded the project a little bit to look at, there's this city parking lot on Springfield Street, which is very barren and is a hot black asphalt. And so we looked at an option that would increase decrease the amount of paving and add new trees into the parking lot. And so again, to try to look at how do we make this overall a benefit. And then Patrick will talk a little bit later, but we really looked at the parking lot in terms of adding street trees, and during that process, we looked at the layout of the parking lot, and we're able to actually add a number of additional parking spaces. So it helps us on the parking count, but it also helps us looking at the overall tree planting in the broader Inman Square area. So if we look at the current concept and say, after, when the project is first completed, we'd have about 85% of the tree canopy that we have today. When we look at 10 years down the road, depending on how those trees thrive, we would have 100 to 135% of the overall tree canopy. And so we're really committed to mitigating any of those impacts. This is sort of a general, and this applies a little bit to some of the things we've been talking about, but really thinking about the environmental benefits of the project and going back a little bit to the safety message, which is that as we make it safer and more comfortable for people to bike and walk and take transit, it really is an opportunity to encourage more people to take those modes and drive less and reduce emissions. So both of those are options. That's really a driver of this project. And one thing I didn't talk about is that we've looked at using lighter colored pavers at both of the plaza reconstructed areas, as well as is there an opportunity for maybe some cooler paving coating that we haven't tried in the city, but on the parking lot, is this an opportunity to try that to further those overall goals? So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Patrick to go through a little bit more in details about the other goals and criteria.
Thank you, Kathy. So just coming back to the safety issue, safety is the basis of this project. This was started in response to the issues that we were seeing in the intersection with a very high crash rate, especially for vulnerable users, bicyclists, pedestrians traveling through the intersection. So looking at the crash data, we saw some of the most common crash types. We had the rear end crashes, angle crashes, sideswipe, and then the bicycle and pedestrian involved crashes, which again frequently result in injuries. So looking at the current concept, just want to kind of walk through it and kind of see how the concept addresses each of these types of crashes.
I'm really sorry, but is the current concept is the previous concept, and the new concept is the alternate concept? Is that how we're supposed to understand these?
Yes. So when
This is confusing. I'm sorry.
Absolutely. So when I talk about the current concept, I'm talking about the concept that we have presented at the last several meetings. And then when I talk about the alternative concept, I'm talking about the one that we had kind of went back to the drawing board to take a look and find a concept that did not impact Vellucci Plaza.
New to us.
Correct.
Sort of like old and new.
So the current concept addresses the bicycle crashes through the separated bicycle lanes through the intersection. It has what we call a protected intersection treatment, where you have the offset crossing. Vehicles, as they turn, are able to look back and see a bicycle. A bicycle is able to see a vehicle turning through and observe that conflict, and both are able to kind of react and stop before a potential crash. We have improved clearance intervals. So again, as I mentioned, today the intersection is very large, and anybody that's gone through there, especially on foot as you walk through some of the crosswalks, you'll see that occasionally a vehicle will get trapped in the intersection. So the light turns red. We have a very long clearance interval today. Even then, given the size of the intersection, sometimes vehicles end up still in the intersection when pedestrians get their walk signal. A pedestrian starts across the crosswalk, and there's still a vehicle trying to exit the intersection. The smaller intersections allow us to shrink those clearance intervals and still make sure we're able to get vehicles out of the intersection prior to pedestrians entering. The current concept restores the protected left turn movements. Those turns are protected, so we don't have the crash types we were seeing prior to implementing the left turn restriction. We're able to accommodate those in a safe way and ensure that people aren't making an illegal move and adding some further confusion and unexpected maneuvers through the intersection. We've got improved signage and lane markings throughout the intersection. Again, having the smaller intersections allow us to place signs in more conspicuous locations and have everything make a little more sense to all the users traveling through. We've got protected bicycle and pedestrian crossings across Hampshire Street. So when those pedestrians are walking across Hampshire Street, there are not vehicles turning across those movements. And again, we've got protected intersection space for the vehicles making the right turns. So looking at the alternative concept, overall you'll see it's very similar. We've got the separated bicycle lanes, we've got the protected crossings, improved signage and lane markings. The one critical issue that we see is we still maintain that left turn prohibition, and the potential for vehicles to disregard that prohibition or misunderstand it result in a significant safety concern. Vehicles might make that illegal left turn, they might stop and wait to make the left turn. This really presents kind of a fatal flaw. We've created an intersection that is not kind of safe and understandable for the everyday driver. If we're creating a situation that's confusing, then we're not creating a safer intersection. So we've also been talking about the transit improvement priorities. Again, we have the 69 and the 83 bus that travel through on Cambridge Street and Hampshire Street, respectively. The current concept does include a transit lane on the eastbound Cambridge Street approach. That is actually one of the highest segments of delay for MBTA buses in the city. There's significant delay, sometimes several minutes per bus that are traveling through the intersection that is both inconvenient for riders and also results in some people choosing not to take the bus as the travel times are not reliable. So as you saw in the concept, it does include that bus lane that allows the buses to bypass the queue of vehicles that are waiting at the light and enter the intersection prior to vehicles. It would also receive an exclusive transit signal that allows it to bypass that queue, enter the center intersection, and then continue on down Cambridge Street. We did also look for the alternative concept at providing a bus lane on the approach. However, as you saw in the rendering of the alternative concept, we ultimately were not able to provide that. What we found was you've got a significant issue at the approach entering the intersection. You've got two lanes here. You've got the vehicle lane and the bus lane, but then as they come around the curve, you've only got the single lane at the internal intersection, so there's no space for the bus and the vehicle to merge. We did look at options to change the signal phasing to ensure that a bus and a vehicle don't enter at the same time, but at that point you're delaying the bus so much in preventing it from merging with the vehicles that the benefit of the bus lane has been removed by the delay for the signal. So looking at analysis of what that bus lane does for transit riders, we're looking at an average savings of 50 seconds per vehicle traveling through the intersection. So each bus that travels through during that morning peak hour is going to save 50 seconds on the approach as they're able to come up to the intersection. You have a line of vehicles approximately 300 feet long. They're able to move into the transit lane, bypass those vehicles. They get the exclusive signal. They move into the intersection. They save a little bit of time. You've got a lot of riders on that bus, so you're really resulting in a net improvement to delay for people traveling through the intersection. Comparing the two concepts on parking, we're finding that they're very similar in the end. We've kind of worked through to identify as many spaces as possible as we're able to retain. We're seeing about 80% of the spaces within the square retained in both concepts. You'll see in the current concept, you do have that transit lane on the eastbound Cambridge Street approach. That's intended to be a peak hour only lane. So from say 7 to 9 or 7 to 10, that would be a transit lane. And then after that time, it will be available for vehicles to park. So you're maintaining that parking during the hours when most of the businesses are typically open. Again, I've already gone through these, but just reminding everybody about our evaluation criteria. And most importantly, the safety in alignment with Vision Zero. I also want to walk through some of the updates we've made to the current concept since the July 2017 meeting for those that have been following along all through this process. We heard a lot of comments from members of the public about desires for additional crosswalks, changes to some of the circulation elements. So the first one is an additional crosswalk from the corner of Antrim Street over to the relocated plaza. We heard from many users of the square, they'd like to see a crossing there. The previous concept had crossings on the west leg and the north leg, but did not provide a crosswalk to get directly to the plaza. So we were able to kind of change how the bike lane alignment works to be able to provide that crosswalk. We heard from several residents of Antrim Street that they were concerned with the proposed reversal. The original concept had reversed Antrim Street, which is presently one-way southbound, to make that one-way northbound. We heard those concerns, so we're now showing Antrim Street as a one-way southbound street as it is today. We had also heard from a lot of people about the desirability of having a crosswalk parallel to Cambridge Street in front of the firehouse, which is a desire line today that you presently have to walk down past Inman Street and then kind of come back up across Hampshire Street. We looked at that, however, we simply find that adding that crosswalk, we create a very long crosswalk. It'd be the longest crosswalk in the square by a pretty wide margin. That actually requires us to increase the cycle length and delay all the other crosswalks. And in the end, you actually increase the delay for pedestrians at all of the other crosswalks to accommodate this one new crosswalk. So in the end, as you're traveling through the square, you're actually, under the current concept, save a little more time by walking down to this crosswalk at the south side of the firehouse than having that crosswalk there. You also have potential ramp issues as the kind of pedestrian signal and ramp are right at the corner where the fire engines are exiting the firehouse. That said, this concept does provide better crosswalk alignment. Presently, you have to walk down to the far side of Inman Street and then kind of walk on a long diagonal back. So now you have a shorter crosswalk that's a little bit closer to the line of travel for pedestrians. We've also heard about concerns about the impacts to parking created by some of the bus stops more on the west side of the square. So we had heard from residents of the condominiums located on the north side of Vellucci Plaza. There was originally a bus stop in this location, and the resulting impact of that bus stop was that there was no curbside access for a vehicle to stop for pickup and drop off, short-term parking, or potential moving activities. So we shifted that bus stop to the far side of the intersection to allow us to restore some of the parking there and ensure that there is some parking within the city of Cambridge, as soon as you kind of go north off of this map, you're actually in Somerville. We also heard similar concerns about parking availability at the pharmacy and the other adjacent businesses. So we again shifted the bus stop that was on the eastbound approach, Cambridge Street at Hampshire Street, over to the far side of the intersection where there's additional parking as well as providing that bus stop. We also heard the concerns about the trees, that the potential tree removals that are happening within Vellucci Plaza. So as Kathy mentioned, we're looking at some concepts where we're providing both additional trees and additional parking within the Springfield Street parking lot. We're able to do that by reducing the currently oversized parking aisle widths down to the typical that you see in other parking lots throughout the city, providing some additional parking along the back side of the fence, and then providing some trees down the center of the aisle. So with that, next steps, we're going to be looking at a community meeting in March to talk about the plaza design. We're going to be finalizing the design and the concept through the spring. There will be some permitting involved in the changes to the plaza. And then we're hoping for a spring, summer for a final open house for the design. So with that, if we can turn some lights back on.
Yes, I'll work on lights.
And I guess before we start the Q&A, I just wanted to say a couple of final things. One was, when we sent out the meeting invite for this meeting a few weeks ago, at that point in time, we very much were in the process of doing all this analysis. And at that point, I think, were feeling like both the current concept and the alternative concept were potentially, obviously the current concept we know we can make work, that the alternative we were developing was something that we felt was a plausible and safe and workable alternative. However, in the time since that meeting notice went out and tonight, we've literally been working on our analysis and putting together the presentation and the information we're sharing this evening up until today, literally. And as we went through that analysis in more detail and really dived down into some of the safety issues, just to be clear, as Patrick said, we found that the alternative had a fatal flaw to it. There's many pros and many cons to both alternatives, but looking at safety, being serious about our commitment to Vision Zero, we did not feel comfortable that that was something, or we do not believe that that's something we can move forward with as an option that would be safe. As I think Patrick mentioned, we would be creating an intersection that day one, out of the box, would have a confusing and potentially hazardous operation. And so that's just not something that we feel or that we want to move forward with. And so with that, well, if you can let me finish, maybe you may. So while all that to say that our plan for moving forward, and again, to go back to the next step slide, is to move forward with the current concept, the concept that we've been discussing for really at this point going on 6 months, or over 6 months really, that was shown at the end that Patrick was referring to, the modifications we've made to more recently. And so I guess what I would say, and again, we're happy to answer questions about this, but we really did try to come up with the best version of a design that would not have an impact on Vellucci Plaza and its current footprint. And at this point, we don't feel like we have a safe design that does that. And so we are intending to move forward with the design that does the changes to Vellucci Plaza and all the other elements that were part of what we're referring to in this meeting as the current concept, and that's what we're intending to move forward with. So I just wanted to make sure that that was very clear to folks in terms of what our plan is moving forward. And like I said, we really did believe that this was something we could make work, and subsequently really just cannot recommend it as something that we would build at this point in time. So with that, we can move on to Q&A.
As I'm sure you're aware, your preferred design requires the use of Vellucci Plaza, which is zoned as open space and is also protected by Chapter 97 of the state constitution. That means that the environment is not just a feature of the plan, but has to be one of the criteria by which it's evaluated. At a minimum, acquiring this approval requires the approval of the City Council and a vote of the state legislature. I and others who have almost 300 people who have signed a letter asking for the trees in Vellucci Plaza to be saved believe there needs to at least be a formal review and public hearing, such as called for in Section 4.25 of the zoning ordinance, to weigh all the considerations, not just the traffic safety, in such a complex and important project. Let's get it right. Such a review requires evaluation of the best possible alternative to taking open space. You have said that Bend Cambridge is not a viable option. Are you sure this is the best possible option? If so, would you make it available for review and critique by the public and other experts before a review of all the other factors? And if not, would you be willing to engage the community members in a cooperative process with your engineers to come up with the best possible traffic design that also preserves Vellucci Plaza in its current form?
So as was pointed out, and I don't think we necessarily said this clearly during the presentation, there is, in order to impact the open space, we do need to go through what's called an Article 97 process, which requires both a vote of the City Council and of the state legislature, as was mentioned. And so, I think we need to work more to explain what that means for everyone, but certainly I think in terms of the question that was asked, we're more than happy to share as much information as we can with the public and with other experts. I think for folks who've been with us through this entire process, this isn't the first time we've had alternative designs looked at, and I think hopefully folks feel like we've been open to those and willing to share and have conversations with other technical experts. So I think we're more than willing to do that. But I just want to reemphasize that the timing of this is very critical, and we want to try to move this project forward as quickly as we can. But we also want to make sure that we've consulted appropriately with the community, which we've done to this point, and will continue to do so. So I can't give us like a super precise answer to your question, but I think we are more than willing to engage in some further discussions as long as we can figure out a way to expedite those and make those happen as quickly as we can. I will say, I think from the staff and consultant perspective, we feel like we have gone through a fairly rigorous process over the course of many months to try to come up with the best plan, and we think this is in fact the best plan. That's not to say that there's sort of a infinite set of possibilities in some sense, but we have to try to converge on what we think is really feasible and what we really think is the best way to move forward with something that will address the critical safety issues. And although I don't disagree that there are a lot of other factors that need to be taken into consideration and that we have taken into consideration, I would say that I think, we have been very publicly stating safety is in fact our number one goal. And I feel very comfortable saying that in front of a room of 100 people or however many people are in the room tonight, because I think that's a very, very good place to be as we are trying to make this intersection as safe as we can. And that's what we've committed to with Vision Zero, and that's what we try to accomplish in all of our projects. So we want to try to accomplish as many other things as we can, but that central goal really needs to remain the central goal that we're trying to pursue. And I guess the last thing I'd say is, I think we need to consult with our city solicitor, but it's unclear that there's any role for the zoning question in this decision. I think it's really a question of, the open space and then the decision of, the city in terms of how we best want to operate this intersection.
Safety is your primary concern. I don't believe you understand what the real safety we're looking at is really about. It's called climate change. We need large trees. We need more large trees than we have than ever before. If you chop down 40 mature trees, you will get zero benefit from the trees you replant for 20 years. What this is really happening here is that you have a much too small view and understanding of what is going on. This is like a lot of lemmings. We, the humans, are like a lot of lemmings, and we're racing towards the cliff. And you are trying to find ways to provide us with safety vests as well as you can in your limited ability in the jobs that you have. The safety vests will not save us. This is really important, and you will see that there are many people in Cambridge who are willing to do civil disobedience if it comes to that.
I really salute the work that you guys have done in the city of Cambridge. I understand the motivation behind the alternative concept. I like what you have done in your analysis, but I would also lend my support to the current concept. I think as a person who bikes and walks through the intersection, I think what you've done is done a fantastic job in keeping both all the vulnerable road users safe. I love the idea of the priority bus route or bus transit option. I think that's fantastic as well. So I would applaud what you've done, and I think it's been a great thorough analysis. I like the accommodations you've made. And I, for one, would highly support the current concept. Thanks.
This is actually my first time viewing this, and the current concept to me, personally, I think is the clear winner. The alternative concept, again, with the left arrow, the left turn possibilities is a nightmare, and it's a current nightmare right now, being a resident of Inman Street. My one concern about this concept, though, is actually the dedicated bus lane, which I understand is good for the environment, et cetera, et cetera. But Cambridge Street, because of the bicycle lanes that are going all the way down Cambridge Street backs up as it is right now in its current configuration, and that's a whole nother topic. Frequently, coming home from Harvard Square, traffic is backed up all the way under the Harvard underpass. And now what I'm seeing happening here with the dedicated bus lane is that we're down to one lane coming into Inman Square. And already traffic backs up a good way back, and I'm just wondering, has anybody really thought about, when you put in this dedicated bus lane, what is that going to do to the traffic all the way down Cambridge Street in Cambridge Street's current configuration with the bicycle lanes and the parking the way it is now?
We are actually seeing that this concept reduces the delay for vehicles on Cambridge Street compared to the existing condition, which is a little unintuitive when you're thinking about one lane versus two lanes. But again, thinking back to that signal cycle, today the cycle is 160 seconds to get through all the movements. With the proposed concept, it's down to 90 seconds. So the phases are coming up more frequently, and we have significantly less additional delay that's caused by those very long all red phases. So right now, 20 seconds out of every 160, all the lights are red while we're waiting to cars to clear the intersection. Now we're able to reduce that substantially, so the time when the signals are all red is a much lower percentage of the cycle, and the cycle is shorter, so the phases coming up more frequently.
Could you firstly speak on the construction impact and projections on how long that will be? And secondly, speak on the batch of trees in front of 1369 in the Druid on Cambridge Street and what you see for that change there, as I know we're shifting the bus.
In terms of I'll start with the more straightforward one. In terms of the impact, those existing trees in front of 1369, the bike lane and the bus stop are on the outside of those, so none of those trees are impacted in either of the designs. So under both scenarios, those trees are not impacted. In terms of construction impacts, both of these options are really a very significant construction effort. The total estimated cost of the project is about $6 million, so that includes both design and construction, and we would anticipate an 18-month to 24-month construction phase, and it really depends on the timing of that, but it's about an 18-month project.
I've been to several of these meetings, but have never spoken before. At the last meeting, several people who had been in Europe, particularly in the Netherlands and UK, spoke about things they'd seen. I don't know if any of these ideas were taken seriously, but I have just come back from several weeks in a foreign country that has a large number, they claim the largest number, of scramble crossings, Barnes Dance crossings, all-way pedestrian crossings. It would seem to me that this would be a vast improvement if you seriously applied this, particularly from the viewpoint of safety. And allow me to add as a footnote, I saw one crossing which had just recently been built that was fully lit at night with LEDs embedded in the pavement for the pedestrians, which is a phenomenal thing for visibility. Thank you. And by the way, this is a tough job you're doing.
Two questions. One that we've been asking since the very first meetings. Is there any estimate of, under the current concept, where the straightest line in the path of least resistance from Hampshire Street going southbound is down Antrim? How much the traffic on Antrim will be increased? It's already a major cut through, and this looks to me like it's the path of least resistance. And also, like, what percentage of the residents on Antrim Street actually spoke out against this? Because there are a lot of Antrim residents who also would love to see it go northbound. The second question is, maybe I misunderstood this, but is it being proposed that along Cambridge Street there will be a lane that will be at some times of the day a travel lane and at some time of the day a parking lane? And if so, is there any other place in the city where that's been tried, and how does it work? Because that seems to me a recipe for confusion and disaster.
So with respect to the direction of Antrim Street, we had originally shown Antrim Street in this concept as reversed to one-way northbound due to the concerns about Antrim Street residents had with the potential for vehicles to come down Hampshire Street, then see Antrim Street as kind of an attractive cut-through route. We had reversed it, and then we had heard from a lot of people that they weren't comfortable with that direction of the street being reversed, and then there's kind of...
What percentage of the residents was it, do you know?
At the time, it seemed like the majority of residents we heard from at that time, but then at later meetings, the vast majority of people we spoke to were against it. That said, what we're looking at now is actually a restriction so that vehicles that come down Hampshire Street would not be allowed to continue straight. Now, that restriction could be a peak hour only, to allow, during the off-peak periods when cut-through traffic is less likely, Antrim Street residents are able to get home, or if we hear from everybody...
From turning left, you'd be able to stop them from going straight?
Yes. I mean, the concern with the left turns is that's a very high-demand movement. Before we restricted the left turn, there were hundreds of vehicles per hour making that turn, whereas, coming down Antrim Street is going to be, it's not nearly as an attractive a movement. It's not kind of the regional Somerville to Boston movement. And in addition, when you get to the south end of Antrim Street, I think you'll realize why you probably shouldn't have taken that route, because it's, as I've experienced myself, very hard to make the turn from Antrim Street onto Broadway. Whereas if you use some of the other routes, you get a traffic signal that allows you to continue on your way to what your destination is.
Would there be something for like abutters that are Hampshire Street residents to be able to get home from Hampshire Street?
So unfortunately, we do not. So the question was, would there be something for abutters only to be able to travel down Antrim Street while still prohibiting that cut-through traffic. Unfortunately, that's not something we can do. We do get requests like that occasionally on residential streets in the city, but when we put up a restriction on traffic, it really has to be for all users to be able to apply to that restriction. The Cambridge Police Department simply can't pull somebody over and, ask what is your origin and destination. That's, not legal or really a reasonable thing for enforcement. So posting something that says abutters only is really not consistent with the definition of a public street and is not enforceable.
In the transit lane? That was the other question.
Oh, yes. So the other question was about the transit lane. Do we have locations where you've got the kind of peak period transit lane and then off-peak parking? Certainly in terms of the transit lane, that would be a new feature. This will be the potentially the first or the second, depending on timing, transit lane in the city of Cambridge. In terms of a lane that's used for parking during off-peak periods and travel during the peak hour, I don't know if we have any.
Well, the city of Cambridge does not operate, that I'm aware of, and I'd like to think I would know, any streets like that. There are many examples of it in Boston. There's definitely an example of it in Davis Square in Somerville. And I would say that it is a challenge, and you have to explain it to people, you have to sign it properly. I think the kind of operation that we're talking about, where it would be parking every time other than probably the morning rush hour, there's a lot lower demand for parking first thing in the morning. Not as many businesses are open. There's fewer people who are kind of out and about just doing their business if they're not at work. And so I think, this is probably a relatively easier way to sort of try this. And I think, if you look around the country, there's lots and lots of places that do this on a regular basis. So I think we would need to be very careful about how we do it, but I don't think there's any sort of big picture reason why to think that this couldn't work if we sort of implement it in the right way. Yes, and that's correct. It's not a city street, but it's a state road. And I would say that that's pretty well obeyed most of the time, which, for Boston drivers, it's a pretty good place to be.
I do have to give a perspective of that use of the streets. And this may sound strange, but the separated bicycle lanes, looks like that requires a lot of trees being taken out and a very, very complicated part of this intersection. So it seems like if it hasn't been done, it would be critical to look at how this could be done without worrying about the separated bike lanes. And it seems like if that much space was not taken up, then a lot of trees could be saved, and this whole project could probably be done with paint and some new traffic lights.
The majority of the locations where the bike lane is shown is kind of outside of where the existing trees are. So the tree impacts really are related to more the alignment of the roadway than the actual bicycle facility.
Park, in this layout, a lot of trees have been lost to those separated bike lanes.
I think what we're saying is that you may perceive that in the drawings, but that's not actually the source of why the trees have to be removed. It's really about the alignment of the road. So, we could go back and forth, but I think what we're saying is that based on the engineering drawings, that's not actually the case. I guess I'd also just say that one of the absolute starting points for this project was the need to accommodate separated bike lanes, and I don't mean to over-dramatize, but we had a cyclist fatality in a manner that I think, based on what we know about the crash, probably wouldn't or may not have occurred had there been separated bike lanes at the time. And so, there's no way to know, but it certainly would have helped. And so I think, that is, all of the designs throughout this entire process from day one have included separated bike lanes, and that's really a critical element of the project. And I think if we had a design that didn't include that through the square, that would be basically eliminated very early on in the conversation.
Hi, I have a question about the cyclist fatality. I'm just told that it had nothing to do with left turning. I don't know how it happened. So that was my original question, and the question was, if left turn lanes are so dangerous, why are you reinstituting one and giving up on enforcement? Have there been any fatalities or accidents? What's the accident rate now that you've eliminated left turns throughout Inman Square? If the incidence has gone up, I'd be very interested. If it's decreased, I'd also be interested. I don't know if you looked at that. And I have an additional comment, and that is looking at the presentation about Vellucci Plaza here and having gone to some of the ones for the Volpe Center as an older person and someone who actually values some quiet even in a city, I'm disturbed that the focus of the city and the planners and the developers is always on what looks to be a hectic open space. It seems to me that the Vellucci Plaza provides an unacknowledged service. The trees also do. They participate in it by calming things down. You may not believe that, and your studies may not show it, but other studies show that urban open space has a very calming and beneficial effect on the public. So I don't think you factored that in. What I see is what a traffic engineer would be trying to do, which is to maximize or make the most efficient throughput and cut down on accidents. So I understand what your focus is, and I'm disturbed that at this very meeting, you announce a fatal flaw for something that's, just sprung on the meeting. But I would ask you to take a different look at the effect of urban open space and trees on traffic.
So, yeah, in reference to the question about the safety, so the initial traffic study that was done showed a crash rate overall that was nearly double the statewide average for signalized intersections. And while a substantial number of those crashes related to left turns, there were really, there was a whole range of crash types that were happening within the intersection. There were the rear end crashes, there were the bicycle and pedestrian crashes, some of which were related to left turns, some of which were not. And the primary issue that was being caused in the case of the left turns was that vehicles don't have a clear idea of where they're supposed to stop to turn left, and that they're crossing a very high volume of vehicles, bicycles, and pedestrians that all kind of happen on parallel movements. So by being able to restore the ability of vehicles to make that left turn, however, in a protected manner, allows that movement to continue to happen in a much safer way than it does today.
Since you just did away with the left turns? Yes.
So
I'd like to know that.
we don't have full crash data. We are pulling together to see what the rate has been since then. We don't have as much data as we typically like to see. Ideally, we typically like to see a 3-year accumulation of crash data. Certainly, we don't want to wait 3 years to have an answer, so we are pulling together at least the 1 year that we do have. Excuse me?
Have there been any fatalities since you did away with the left turns?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Have there been any fatalities otherwise?
So there was a cyclist fatality in 2016. We don't have the full details of that crash. As far as I know, that was not related to a left turn movement.
But you don't know what did cause it?
So we don't have the full details. The crash report has not been released still.
And so the redesign is to answer a question that we don't actually know.
So it really is in response to that very high crash rate for all users of the intersection.
A woman was doored, and 2 months later, a woman was killed in Central Square by being doored. That's right.
So, and we do know that, dooring crashes are a concern across the city, and the separated bike lanes in this concept do address the risk for dooring for cyclists as they travel through the square.
It kind of looks like the die is cast on this because I attended a meeting a couple of months ago in which really cogent, viable arguments were made to preserve Vellucci Plaza and to try to re-engineer the project with that as a given criterion for the project. That the idea was preserve the plaza, solve the problems like designers do. And I'm an architect, and I'm given parameters for projects all the time, and I need to obey those parameters and solve the problem. But that isn't, clearly you've come to the conclusion that it wasn't solvable and have gone on from there. But I'll just say, just going forward with the City of Cambridge, I'm really, really disturbed about the lack of a conviction for preserving trees. It's just a real problem. And I'm not sure I'm at the point where I'm going to chain myself to a tree, but I'm getting to that point. I'm getting to that point because I'm not seeing trees thrive, and I'm not seeing young trees grow and develop into shade trees like we expect an urban forest to provide for us. And so this constant remove the trees, we'll plant more trees than there were before, just really isn't working. And you have to understand that as a city. You have to understand that you will not have shade trees at this rate. I just would like to absolutely. Susan would like to speak, if that's all right.
I just want to provide some data to back up Maggie's point, which is that I wanted to ask you if you're aware of the 2 groundbreaking studies that came out this fall. One of them was a first ever analysis of what was happening to our tree canopy. And in the 5-year period that began in 2009 and ended in 2014, there was an overall 7% decline in our tree canopy in Cambridge. The second study was the urban heat island effect study that you alluded to, but didn't really provide information on. That study forecast a tripling of heat days by 2030 and suggested that increasing the tree canopy coverage was one of the absolute best ways to mitigate the heat island effect. And it, not having known about the other study, it projected scenarios in which the tree canopy coverage would be increased by 30 or 40%. So my 2 questions are, number 1, have you read these studies? And number 2, how do you plan to take these studies into account in the future?
We have a couple challenges. One is, how are we planting new street trees? And so I think some of the details I've talked about are about, as we're planting new street trees or new trees in plazas and other open spaces, what measures are we putting in place to make sure those trees really thrive? And so it's not sufficient to say, oh, we're planting trees and that's adequate. So I think if you look at what we've done over the last number of years, we've really changed the way we're planting new street trees, talking about really changing the way we do it in larger open spaces and plazas. Also looking at changing the way we water trees. So traditionally we've, reached out to residents and said, can you help sponsor a tree and water a tree? And, that goes a little bit, but isn't sufficient. And so, the Department of Public Works has really changed the way we water trees. And so as we're doing new tree plantings, there's a contract in place to continue watering until those trees can really establish. And then in terms of the urban heat island, we're looking at ways to mitigate that. And part of that is about tree planting. And so the city we're about to undertake an urban forestry master plan, and there's a call out now for members, and so we're actively looking for people to participate in that. And that is definitely to make sure that we're looking at all of those things in all these different types of projects. I will also say that with all of our projects, we're looking at balancing a lot of different needs. And so the trees are an important part of that. How people get around transportation-wise is an important part of that. How we support local businesses is an important part of that. And, maintaining our own infrastructure is important. And so we're always trying to balance all of these things. So I'm not saying that every project is going to be able to optimize tree planting, but we are trying to look much more holistically across the city about what steps we can take.
So I live in the neighborhood, and thank you for taking an earnest second look at your design and coming back with your analysis of the alternate. You've mainly answered most of my questions about the new planting technologies that you're planning to use, and I wonder, I totally get the concerns about the mature trees and other environmental concerns. I wonder, could you talk any more about other opportunities with the current concept for other environmental benefits. Do you think that you'll be looking at any stormwater or rain gardens, permeable pavers, anything that could have sort of a net gain considering the loss of the trees?
Yeah, so I think, we're really at, 50 to 75% design, and so we're continuing to look at those details. I think, certainly as we look at the larger parking lot and trying to expand the scope of this project so that if we can't meet all of our goals in a smaller area, are we broadening that conversation? We've definitely, I think one of the maps had some pink colors on it that were very subtle. We're looking at what the color of those materials are, so to use lighter pavers in the open space, as well as treatment of the parking lot, and then looking at stormwater management in the parking lot. And so certainly as we get into those final design, we'll be pulling more of those aspects into it.
I read somewhere that the root structure of a large tree is approximately in the circumference of the branches and leaves of the tree. So I can understand why something 50 years old.
Yes, you gotta speak louder.
I don't hear that very often.
Closer.
More seldom, Fritz. I have read that the root structure of a large tree is roughly equivalent to the perimeter of the entire branch structure of the tree. So I can understand why a 50-year-old tree would be very difficult to move and therefore perhaps has to be removed. But it seems to me that the street trees you're planting are relatively small, and I can understand the temptation to have that convenience. But could we hedge our bet somewhere by planting the largest trees we could conveniently handle? Because Cambridge can afford that, and it could cut off 10 or 15 years of growth, it would seem to me.
Yeah, and I think, we certainly look at what's the ideal size of a tree to plant. And typically when we're looking at narrower sidewalks, we want trees that can really adapt to the new environment and grow. And so we tend to go on the smaller side. I would say the Western Ave trees, we actually planted 3.5-inch caliper as opposed to the 2-inch caliper. And those have done exceptionally well. And then I also think, as we're looking at a plaza area where you have more space to work with, that's another opportunity to plant larger trees because you have more space to work with. So certainly as we get into it, absolutely.
If you could err on the size of the larger rather than smaller, I think we'd be a little ahead of the game.
No, and I think it makes a big difference in terms of how, especially when it's an open space, how that space feels from day one. Absolutely.
Great, thank you. I'm Becca Wolfson from the Boston Cyclists Union. I also live in Inman Square, Union Square in Somerville, and bike through this intersection every day. So I know the safety issues and experience them, and really waiting for this to be done so that it feels much safer and much more comfortable. The project we're talking about is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I commend the staff for looking at ways to make this work better for everyone, not just safer for vulnerable road users, but better for businesses. This wasn't the concept that we initially supported and that many cyclists supported, but you heard that a plaza next to the businesses was a priority, and you made a plan that achieves that. And I think you looked at ways to accommodate other needs, and again, commend that, but really agree that the fatal flaw with the alternative plan is just too much risk. With Vision Zero, it says that we can't rely on human behavior. We have to have infrastructure that forces people to do the right thing, and the other plan just doesn't achieve that. The 4 trees that are removed with the Volucci Plaza change are significant, of course, but another way that we'll achieve environmental protection is by getting more people to shift their mode of travel. We hear from people all the time that they don't feel safe anymore and they won't bike because of the fatality that occurred in the square. If we want to encourage more people to ride, to make them safe, to make them feel comfortable, we have to change the infrastructure. So of course, the impact on the trees is real, but we have to balance that with the mode shift and the safety of getting hundreds and thousands of more people to bike. The only other thing that I want to say is I am concerned about the timeline. The fatal crash that sped up this process occurred 1.5 years ago, and seeing that there's going to be another meeting in March and a final design concept meeting in the summer, and construction with no date is a big concern. So I really would like to hear that you're going to start construction in 2018, and we'll do everything you can to stop any more delays and move this project forward.
Hi, I have a couple of very specific questions and then a slightly broader one. One is, can you just verify, it seems clear based on the design that in the current concept, Springfield Street will remain two ways. Comment on any planned changes to the 91 bus route related to that. And then secondly, on the issue of bike safety, I'm just curious if there's any thought yet to supplementing these infrastructural changes with enforcement of traffic rules for cyclists. One of the most important ways to make bicycling safer, I think, in the city is to teach drivers that they can trust us to follow the law. So we have to make sure that we force all of us to follow the law when we're biking.
So with regards to the question about Springfield Street, it is two-way on this plan. There is an additional turn restriction in that vehicles cannot make the turn from Cambridge Street to Springfield Street, just due to the safety and the kind of conflicts that are happening at that movement. So that does necessitate changes to the 91 route to move that over to Prospect Street. We have been talking to the MBTA about making that change. They have also noted that that results in a substantial reduction in delay for the 91 route, which currently makes a series of turns through Union Square and then coming in through Inman Square, and removes something like, I think it's 5 signals from the route for the 91 bus, and also several turns, that it's able to just continue straight up Prospect Street, use that new bus lane that's in Union Square, and then it would kind of come through just off the plan on the east side. So it'd still provide a stop adjacent to Inman Square, but it would not come down Springfield Street. That also, yes, Springfield Street is two ways. That does also address the existing issues that happen today where Springfield Street is simply too narrow for two-way bus traffic. So you'll frequently see them just trying to squeeze by if there's 2 buses going in each direction, or if there's a truck or another larger vehicle on Springfield Street. And just real quick, in regards to the law enforcement, we have heard from the Cambridge Police Department that they do issue a significant number of violations to bicyclists when they see cyclists running red lights or violating other rules. They are ticketing them just like they do drivers that violate those same laws.
Can I ask a question, please, about the northbound turns, specifically Springfield Street? Okay. Specifically turning onto Springfield Street, and I beg your pardon if I missed this at the beginning, but if people can't go north on Springfield turning from Cambridge, if they're heading east and then want to go north, say towards Union Square, and they can't go north on Hampshire either, that means, can they not also go left on Prospect to go north, or can they?
Yes, the left turn is legal to Prospect, and
Okay.
nothing will
So
change
then
there.
we're going to go from 3 ways to go north off of Cambridge, turning left, to 1.
So just a note that the left turn from Cambridge Street to Hampshire Street has been illegal for as long as any of us know, so that's not a new turn restriction.
That's true. Okay, that's true. But you can't go, you're not going to be able to go left on Springfield. Okay, so that's 2 down to 1, and Prospect, as we know, is still really crowded already. So what does that mean for the little tiny streets, particularly Oak Street, which is the only through way from Cambridge Street connecting to Prospect Street? It's a one-way, it's got parking on that, and it's the densest part of Somerville already.
So, we are working with the city of Somerville to continue to monitor the circulation in the neighborhoods. If we see that there's kind of unintended cut-through issues, we'll look at, if there are, problems that are resulting from that. It's certainly something that we can address. We have already seen somewhat of a reduction in vehicles turning left on Springfield Street just due to the changes in Union Square. A lot of those vehicles were going up Springfield Street and then onto Newton Street and kind of doing that diagonal over to Prospect Street, which is no longer a legal movement on the Somerville side. So a lot of those drivers, they've kind of lost that route and have already diverted to Prospect Street or, to other routes kind of outside of the area.
Oak Street, which is a tiny little street, which has a lot of kids and a lot of pedestrians and a lot of parked cars where people are running through in between cars. So I just worry that you're displacing danger from one spot to another.
And we certainly will, continue to monitor. If we see that, there's issues, like I mentioned, there's a possibility of making changes to make sure that we don't have those kind of unintended effects.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Andrew McFarland. I'm with Livable Streets Alliance. Livable Streets has been really involved in this project. We've been on the task force working with the city and other community members on this. And I just wanted to, I've been involved in a lot of planning processes around the Boston area, but also in New York. And I can pretty safely say that this is one of the best and most thorough community planning projects I've seen. The city of Cambridge has done a lot of work to consider every available option, to weigh benefits, to evaluate all the criteria in this very, very complex intersection. And I think that they've done a really great job in that regard. And I really would like to applaud the commitment to Vision Zero and safety, and just acknowledge that this is going to save lives. This design is definitely going to make this square safer for a lot of road users. And going off of that, very supportive of the current concept. And I think that ideas like the left-hand turns in the alternative concept are just dangerous and would support the current concept. And I think this is really going to drastically improve mobility for everyone in the square. Really excited to see the transit provisions in this. I think the Q jump will definitely encourage more riders on the 69 bus route and also get more people out of their cars. And I think that that's also a really important point that Becca brought up, is that transportation emissions are the largest contributor to greenhouse gases, not only in Massachusetts, but in the nation. If we really want to see aggressive ways to combat climate change, then we really need to be looking at limiting car emissions, looking to get more people biking, walking, taking transit. This is like a really rare project where we're able to do all three of those things, so which it never happens in Boston or anywhere in Cambridge or anywhere. So I think this is a really great plan, and I'm really excited to see it on the ground.
I appreciate all the hard work you've done, but it doesn't make me happy. I bike, I walk, and I drive. I bike often to East Cambridge to my fish market. I walk to the post office in Inman Square, and to get back home on Fayette Street, I cut through the parking lot of the bank. Then I get to Hampshire Street, and then I can cross over the crosswalk at Riles, and then around to Fayette Street. If I come down Hampshire Street, to get to Fayette Street now, I just go across to Antrim and then around to Fayette. In your plans, I'm not sure what I'll do. Do I have to go all the way up to Maple to get to Broadway so that I can get to Fayette Street? And then we haven't discussed snow. We had a significant snowfall a few weeks ago, and unless the city can come up with a much better plan of clearing not only the streets, but the banks along the sidewalks, a car will pull up on a clear piece of street and then won't be able to open their doors, or they won't be able to climb over the snowbanks. I mean, even if businesses or people clear their sidewalks, there's still probably a bank. There's got to be some way to do it that's better, because otherwise all your safety plans and all your wonderful designs are going to come to naught. I am very concerned about the trees. I am 81 and a half. The trees that are in Bellucci Park now were planted about 40 years ago, and I think they were at least 10-year-old trees. That means they're 50 years old. I'm not going to see new trees that you plant in 50 years. I would love to, but I don't think I'm going to be around. I remember two ladies named Jane who lived on Antrim Street who watered them faithfully. And then I think they got the Public Works to put a faucet in so that they wouldn't have to carry gallons of water from their homes. It really has a lot of meaning. Now, maybe the present inside design of the park could be rethought of so that there can be gatherings there and so on. But I know when the park was first proposed, some of the businesses were concerned that there would be homeless people hanging out there. Maybe there are a few, but I just don't see gobs and gobs of, homeless type people there. I think it's used, when I see it, by families or friends or people sitting there. Not a hell of a lot of use, but the quiet area that it allows is very significant. On Western Avenue, you have a dedicated...
A little closer. Just closer.
On Western Avenue, you have a dedicated bike lane that's the same height as the sidewalk. On Cambridge Street, your dedicated bike lane is not the same height as the sidewalk, and the cars are like parked out in the middle of the street, so that if somebody is parked and opens a door, the cars coming up the street on a narrower lane have to stop so the door can be opened, or problems. Then, if you're in that bike lane and somebody who's driving wants to make a right turn, the biker and the driver have to be careful that they're not cutting somebody off. And that, I'm sure, has happened before, because I heard some people talking about it. On Fayette Street, you now can't empty into Cambridge Street onto 2 lanes. You can only empty onto 1 lane that's going to go through and 1 lane that's going to turn right onto Hampshire Street. One day last week, there was such a backup that I finally called the traffic department to complain, because the traffic was backed up from Cambridge Street to Broadway and couldn't get out. I mean, it was not just a matter of 5 minutes. It was there for a while, so I called them, and they said they would look into it. Trees. On Fayette Street, you cut down, not you personally, but the city cut down 3 Norway maples near the Broadway end. They were diseased, I was told. They have planted some twigs. I'm sure their intention is good, but they don't look very hardy. And it's going to be a long time before they provide the kind of cover that's needed to be calling them street trees with shade, street shade trees. I don't see the point of creating dividing Bellucci Plaza into 2 pieces. I really don't. And I am feeling so strongly about and protective toward those trees, I may do some civil disobedience. I really feel very strongly that you got to find another way to do it. Other thing I want to point out is where Kirkland crosses Beacon, the lights work such that people can cross all at once in different directions, or even diagonally. I think something like that might work in the Inman Square area. I'm not quite sure how or when, but it seems to me that there ought to be a pedestrian signal on the light that would let everybody cross at once, and then have to wait a while.
Thank you.
I wish you luck. So far, I'm not happy.
Hi, my name is Andrew, and I live on Amory Street, which is on the bottom right-hand corner of your slide, not showing, right opposite the bank. And my biggest complaint is that the bank closes their parking lot whenever I want to walk through it. But more seriously, I'm a planner, and I appreciate all the work that goes into these things, and I know it's going to take a while to if this is in fact the plan, to get it to fruition. But I wasn't at the last meeting, where it sounds like some of the alternative concepts, such as a less controlled intersection, came up, and I wish I was there for those conversations. So I'd love to, like, maybe a 1-sentence or 2-sentence recap of why those sorts of things really are not an option for here. I look at this and I see all the control that we're trying to establish, and I get nervous that we're creating more of a problem. And I wonder, are we able to entertain things like, we are in Cambridge, we are in a place where we can influence lifestyle change, and would this intersection be an opportunity to consider just a much slower speed limit, and just encourage and enforcing the fact that you're in a neighborhood now, you need to slow down, you need to look around, and you need to yield to everything around you, period. And I'm just curious of that kind of thing in general. So thanks for hearing.
Real quick, on the question about the alternative intersection designs, and we could go on for a whole other meeting, I won't do that. Just suffice it to say, we did look very carefully at a concept that was referred to earlier for a roundabout or a double roundabout in Inman Square, and although there were some, in a way like the conversation we're having tonight, there were some very appealing aspects to that. When we looked at it, in that case, there was both an issue of it physically fitting within the intersection, which was very difficult to make work, and then we felt that there was a potential for the entire intersection to sort of lock up in a way that would create tremendous delays for and potential safety issues for vulnerable users as well as for drivers, but particularly for cyclists and pedestrians. And so, although, like I said, we went through a very similar analysis to try to figure out if we could make it work. In the end, we made a sort of similar decision that we couldn't figure out a way to make it work, and so we went with the concept in front of you. And then in terms of speeds, I'll just say we are intending, by state law, the lowest we can make our speed limit is 20 miles per hour as a safety zone, so-called. We are intending to implement safety zones in all of our squares, including Inman Square, so in the not too distant future, we hope to be reducing the speed, even before this project is built, reducing the speed limit to 20 miles per hour. My hope would be people would, most of the time, even be below that, but hopefully we can keep them in the 20 mile per hour range, which is just to say, that's a point at which the likelihood of a pedestrian or cyclist fatality, if they're hit by a moving vehicle, becomes significantly lower. And so we see that as an important threshold to get to in locations with this much activity.
I first want to say that I'm really happy with the new location for Vellucci Plaza. The current location is so peaceful and quiet because so few people find it in a convenient location. The loss of the trees is sad, but I think that the pleasantness to the local environment will be offset by moving a large number of people out of their cars and into walking and biking and transit, and that will make this area much more pleasant to be in, even without those trees. I have 3 questions. The 91, since it doesn't really depend on this, could that be moved to eliminate those 6 turns like tomorrow? And moving the bus stops to the east side for the eastbound buses, does that affect, or does that mean transit signal priority is possible for those buses in those directions? And finally, for construction impacts, the less disruptive you try to make construction, the longer it takes. If you close down the whole intersection like they did by the BU Bridge recently, construction could be pretty quick. Where are you thinking about being on that spectrum?
So with respect to the 91 bus, we actually are planning on meeting with the MBTA within the next 2 weeks to kind of walk the route and figure out what the changes we need to do to put in the additional bus stops on Prospect Street. So that change is something that likely will happen prior to construction, because once the intersection is under construction, having the 91 bus out of there is, helpful to delay on that route. And as you mentioned, the overall route is a delay improvement for riders that are traveling through Union and Inman Square towards Central Square or towards Sullivan Square. With regards to the, what's the question on the bus stops?
Signal priority.
Oh, the signal priority, yes. So, with regards to the signal priority, we are still looking at what other improvements we can make besides the transit priority lanes. So as we get into the more detailed design of the traffic signal, we probably will have opportunities to add signal priority, which is simply, if there's a bus approaching and the light is about to turn red, the bus can communicate with the signal, and the signal can hold that green for an additional 5 or 10 seconds to allow that bus to get through before the signal changes. So we are looking at that as well.
And then in terms of construction phasing, we have not started looking at how the project would be phased and constructed. You're absolutely right. The more space you give the contractor, more ability to work, the shorter the duration. And so I think, over the last number of years, we've been trying to give the contractors a little more space and, looking at closing down streets where it makes sense. The challenge here is looking at the buses, the truck traffic, and also the emergency access to the fire station, and then thinking about where that traffic would move to. But certainly, as we get into the design and sort of detailed construction docs, we'll be looking at that.
I wanted to mention for those who may not be aware that the majority of the Inman Square Neighborhood Association prefers the current plan, largely because of the way it moves part of Vellucci Plaza across the street and creates this new plaza in front of Muna and Punjabi Dhaba. From an urban design point of view, the Inman Square Neighborhood Association has as a very high priority doing what it can to help out the struggling business district in Inman Square. For those of you who frequent the square for other than just passing through it know what a struggling situation we have there. And it was felt that having this new plaza with the restaurants and other business behind it, rather than streets on both sides, and having fixed tables and chairs there would be a significant, meaningful boost to the commercial district. Also, in our early meetings, the Neighborhood Association is a little over a year old. It was interesting to note that the top priority seemed to be the creation of a social gathering space in the square. People seem to respond very highly to this plaza idea, joining the businesses as opposed to separated from them with fixed tables and chairs, as something that would significantly help accomplish that goal and create a social gathering space in the square. We feel a little, anyway, so that was important for us, and that's really why we prefer this plan as opposed to the alternative, I think. It was somewhat, I thought it was comforting to note that in this heat island study that was just done, it says that it'll take, if the current plan is implemented, it says that that means that those 4 of the 6 large trees would be taken in the plaza. More trees would be planted and are taken, but as we all know, the trees are little and it takes a long time for them to grow. So it would take 10 years for us to get back to the point where we are today in terms of the heat island in Inman Square. And not just because of the trees, it's because there's less asphalt in this design, as they've noted. But at least after the 10 years, then we'll have a smaller and smaller heat island than we have today as the trees grow. Bigger trees, obviously. If you plant bigger trees to start with, then the heat island could be reduced maybe in 8 years instead of 10 years or something like that. But at any rate, I just wanted to communicate why one group felt that strengthening the business district was, we had an opportunity to do something, right? Take advantage of the reconfiguration. We wanted to try to take advantage of it, not just for the safety purposes, but also to try and strengthen the commercial district, and we feel that this does that.
So as I mentioned, I think we're gonna, like I said, it's 8 o'clock, a few minutes past. We're gonna wrap up this part of the Q&A. Like I said, we're more than happy to stick around to talk. You can look for folks who have these exciting, lovely name badges on, and we can direct you to the right person if we're not the right person.